Hello again everyone. Last week I chose to review the first Twilight movie for Valentine's Day, and of course I didn't much care for it. But while I did have a few not so kind words to say about the writing, there's more to be said about Twilight and why I think it's a bad series than just that. I am of course talking about the messages and implications of Twilight, which frankly I felt deserved their own video. Now, Twilight has always received a lot of backlash, and as I said in the previous video, some of the criticism was arguably made in bad faith. So before I talk about my major issues with this series and its implications, I'd like to address the criticisms that were perhaps a bit unfair. See, a lot of the backlash for Twilight was less to do with its content and more to do with its audience, that audience being teenage girls. Now, don't get me wrong, some of Twilight's fanbase could be considered very obnoxious, but quite frankly, that's the case for basically every single fandom under the sun. The pure fact that it was aimed more towards women, plus mostly focused on romance, did however result in a lot of sexism and in some cases homophobia from the haters. And yeah, that's not cool. Just because something is aimed towards women or focuses primarily on romance does not automatically make it lesser, nor does it warrant hatred purely based on that fact. Again, I'm not saying Twilight is above criticism here, it absolutely isn't. But if your criticism is mostly just mocking the fact that it's for girls, then it is kind of unfair. For example, you may notice in my previous review, I never once criticised the fact that the vampires sparkle. The sparkly vampire joke is always brought up when mocking Twilight, when in reality it's not really that big of a deal compared to the bad writing. I'm not saying it's handled gracefully, but it does feel like a good example of something minor that people pounce upon simply because it's perceived as too girly. Now, I have seen a lot of people rushing to Twilight's defense by calling out a lot of this criticism, which is fair. But one thing I do have to take issue with is people acting like Twilight is actually a good piece of media, or God forbid that it's empowering for women. Now, obviously these things are very subjective, and this is just my opinion, but I personally would not describe Twilight as good, and I absolutely don't believe it's empowering for women. At all. And to say that Twilight is either of these things purely because some of its backlash had sexist undertones feels kind of insulting towards pieces of media aimed towards women that actually were good and well written. Now, you may be wondering, would I go as far as to say Twilight is misogynistic? Well, maybe. On the one hand, a lot of the bad messages that Twilight gives off are very much rooted in societal sexism, but on the other hand, if the characters' genders were swapped here, I'm fairly certain the big issue would be just as problematic. So, what is the big issue in question? Well, simply put, Twilight is a glorification of toxic and abusive relationships. I already went into some detail in my previous review as to why Edward Cullen is a terrible love interest. But now it's time to really focus on that. First, Edward obsesses over Bella to the point of literally stalking her, and when around her, he practically blames her for his uncontrollable desire. When she starts to wise up to the truth, he flat out tries to gaslight her. For those of you who don't know, gaslighting is when you try to make a person doubt themselves and their sanity by falsely telling them that their perceptions are wrong. Just like how Edward tells Bella she just imagined seeing his super strength and speed. It's a classic technique of abusers, and it's very noticeable here. Edward's obsession with Bella soon becomes extremely controlling, which he insists is only for her safety. Again, classic abuse tactic. For example, in the later installment Eclipse, Edward literally tampers with Bella's truck to try to prevent her from visiting Jacob, cutting her off from friends, especially those he's jealous of, being another classic abuse tactic. Edward really does have a disturbing sense of authority over Bella and tries to use it to control her, always using her safety and his love as an excuse. Even the small details draw some very uncomfortable parallels to real-life abusive relationships, like how Edward suddenly acts nice and charming in front of Bella's friends and family, then goes straight back to being a creep when talking to Bella, or how her later injuries are explained away to her family as her having fallen down the stairs. Bella, while not deserving of such treatment, does have her own issues as well, one of them being codependency. When Edward leaves her in New Moon, she becomes practically catatonic for months, then repeatedly endangers her own life just to try to see him again. This is severely unhealthy, and I don't feel the story is properly portraying it as such, since the two of them go straight back to unhealthily obsessing over one another when, really, Bella should be talking to a therapist at this point. The relationship can be summarised as a very controlling partner repeatedly attempting to dominate his desperate codependent partner, neither of whom can live without the other. It's not okay, and it's not healthy. Now here's the thing. The problem is not simply the depiction of a toxic relationship. It's the fact that the series is completely unaware of the fact that the relationship is so toxic, and instead it glorifies and romanticizes it. Presenting a toxic relationship on screen is fine, so long as there is some clear awareness on the writer's part that what's being presented is toxic, and not desirable true love. And some folks might argue that dark, predatory partners can be erotic to audiences. And this is very much the case for a lot of people. But again, here's the thing. For starters, it's possible to make a sexualized, predatory character while still making them the antagonist. And second, Twilight is not an erotic novel, it's a romance novel. It's not trying to be anyone's sexual awakening. It's actually encouraging abstinence and the repression of sexuality. Look, I'm not saying that chastity is automatically a bad thing, but I am saying that Twilight is not a novel asking young women to explore their flourishing sexuality. It's a novel that encourages them to marry young to satisfy your manipulative partner's desire for chastity, then be rewarded with weird, violent super sex. And while there is a big difference between presenting a sexy, predatory character for erotic purposes and presenting one for romantic purposes, even then, it's still possible to get it wrong. But that's a story for another video. Now, all that is bad, and I'd like to think a lot of you could agree on that. And if you don't, well, now it's time to talk about the even bigger issue. One I hope everyone can agree on. See, glorifying toxic relationships is already pretty bad, so how can it get worse? Simple, by glorifying child grooming. And if you don't want to hear about this, then please skip to this section of the video. Later on in the Twilight Saga, after we meet the werewolves, we learn that werewolves in this universe have the built-in power of imprinting. That being that when a werewolf meets someone they detect to be their soulmate, then they will immediately become magically obsessed with that person to the point of practically becoming their love slave. That is, already on its own, horrifying. But it's worse than you think, because sometimes the person in question is a child. So what happens then? Well, the werewolf in question becomes a major part of the child's life, pretty much helping to raise them and gain their trust, all with the intention of eventually mating with them. Yeah, it's absolutely standard child grooming. That is abhorrent, yet once again it's presented as acceptable. A lot of people are aware of the love rival Jacob Black eventually imprinting on Bella's daughter Renesmee, but not as many people are aware of the other age gap couple, a werewolf named Quill who imprints on a 2-year-old named Claire. Claire and Quill. Oh boy, right. Twilight, you can do all the hand-waving you want, but I really have to ask at this point, if the age gap imprinting isn't supposed to be a parallel to child grooming, then why, in the name of all that is good in the world, is one of the couples named after a character from Lolita? Like, please tell me this is just a weird coincidence, or a bad joke, but even then, it isn't funny. The problem with Twilight is not simply that it glorifies these terrible things, it's that it's presenting the glorification to a young and impressionable audience. While most teenagers will be well aware that having sex with a child is unforgivably bad, and they won't need a book to tell them that, I'm not certain all of them are necessarily aware that child groomers typically don't just attack kids out of nowhere, but rather manipulate and dote upon their victims before pressuring them into sex. It's why so many young victims tragically fall into these traps. And because of this, presenting such abhorrent behaviour as acceptable and romantic is flat out dangerous. If there's one last thing I want to mention though, it's this. I don't necessarily blame the writer for giving off such terrible messages. I will criticise her writing, sure, I don't think it was very good. But, ignoring the extremely inappropriate naming reference, I don't think it was ever her intention to present toxic or abusive relationships as good, necessarily. I think the real issue is that a lot of society is completely misinformed as to what abusive relationships can look like, and I'm assuming that's had its effect on this writing. A lot of people still assume all abusers are straight, middle-aged men who beat their wives for the hell of it. But that simply isn't the case. Abusers do come in all shapes and sizes. They aren't always men, they aren't always physical, and in a lot of cases, they aren't just doing it because they're drunk or angry. A lot of people trapped in abusive relationships stay with their partners simply because they have no idea what's being done to them is abuse, or because they think their partners are really sweet and loving when they aren't destroying their self-worth. And I'm not saying Twilight is responsible for this, nor would a more accurately presented Twilight fix this. I mean, I've seen people glorify the Joker and Harley Quinn's relationship, despite it always being presented as wholly toxic. Because some people simply don't understand healthy relationships or boundaries, and works of fiction are not going to fix that. If you like Twilight, that's okay. Just be aware that what's being depicted as a perfect relationship is not healthy nor aspirational in the real world. I do realise this is pure fantasy, and that if Twilight didn't exist, it wouldn't make that much of a difference to the number of unhealthy relationships out there. It is a symptom, not a cause. But at the same time, glorifying toxic relationships isn't a good thing. And as such, even though I now see a lot of the backlash towards the franchise was unjustified, to this day I still maintain the series was not and never will be good. At the end of the day, while it's not going to change the world, sometimes a little bit of criticism, when made in good faith, can still be valid. Thanks for watching the video. Like I said last time, I might review the other Twilight films in future, but I was thinking I might just turn those into Patreon-only reviews. Though 50 Shades of Grey is certainly on the radar, so expect to see a full review of that on this channel in future. As always, like, share and subscribe and donate to me on Patreon if you can, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye.